morning was cold and silent. Snow covered everything, soft and white, hiding the scars of the camp. Private Thomas Reeves sat by a wooden table, holding a small piece of paper. He had been trying to write that letter for days. He did not know what to say anymore. How can you tell someone you're all right when you're not? Around him, the camp was still half asleep. A few men cleaned their rifles. Others stared at the horizon with empty eyes, waiting for something they no longer believed in. Thomas began to write. Dear Anna, the snow here reminds me of home. It is strange. The colder it gets, the more I think about the warmth of your hands. I do not know when this will end, but I hope you still keep that photograph of us by the river. That day feels like another lifetime. He stopped writing. The pencil stayed still. His thoughts drifted back to that day before the war, before the noise. He could almost hear her laughter again, soft and distant like the sound of water over stones. Then a voice broke the silence. Reeves, you're on duty in 10 minutes. He folded the letter and placed it in his jacket. Inside were many more letters, all unsent. He never posted them. He was no longer sure there was a home left to send them to. Outside, the cold air struck his face. Frost covered the tents, the trucks, and the tired faces of men who had forgotten what hope felt like. A few steps away, Sergeant Miller stood by a map pinned to a truck. Listen, lads, he said. Command wants us to move at dusk. The Germans have taken the ridge beyond the river. We cross tonight. Thomas felt his stomach tighten. Everyone knew that ridge. It was a death trap. But orders were orders. He looked once more at the horizon. Snow kept falling, slow and silent like ashes from a world that was burning away. And as he walked towards the trucks, he thought, if I do not come back, maybe someone will find these letters one day. He pulled his helmet strap tight and stepped into the snow, one more soul among thousands. The sun began to fade behind the frozen hills. The camp moved in silence. Men packed their gear, checked their rifles, and tied their boots without a word. Each one knew what night would bring. Thomas sat by the fire, watching the smoke curl into the darkening sky. The flames flickered softly, casting long shadows across the mud. He thought of Anna again, of the smell of her hair when she leaned close, of the way she said his name when she laughed. It felt like something that belonged to another man in another life. A few yards away, Sergeant Miller folded the map and looked up. Right, lads, he said quietly. This is it. We cross the river after nightfall. No lights, no noise. Keep your heads down and stay close. No one answered. They just nodded. Orders were orders. When the last bit of sunlight disappeared, the line began to move. Boots sank into the snow. The only sound was the faint creak of frozen fabric and the whisper of breath in the cold. Each man carried more than his rifle. He carried fear. He carried memories. He carried the weight of all the faces he might never see again. As they reached the riverbank, a pale mist hung over the water. The current was slow but deep, black as oil under the moonlight. Thomas took a breath and stepped in. The cold bit through his boots, straight into his bones. He clenched his teeth, trying not to make a sound. Halfway across, the silence broke. A single shot, and then another. The night exploded with light and chaos. Down! Take cover! Someone shouted. Bullets tore through the mist. Men fell into the freezing water. The air filled with cries and the sharp echo of gunfire. Thomas threw himself behind a fallen log, his heart pounding in his ears. He could see nothing but flashes of light, shapes moving in the dark. He pressed his face against the mud and whispered, "Please, let this end." Minutes felt like hours. When the firing finally stopped, the river was quiet again. The mist had returned, hiding everything the living and the dead. Thomas lifted his head slowly. He was shaking. Beside him, Miller crawled through the snow, bleeding from his arm, but still breathing. "Are you hit?" Miller asked. Thomas shook his head. "Then keep moving. We're not done yet." They pushed forward, step by step, through the dark woods on the other side of the river. Somewhere behind them, the water carried away the letters Thomas had written. One of them slipped from his pocket in the chaos and drifted downstream, a silent message floating through the ruins of a world at war. The forest was silent again. Only the crunch of snow under their boots broke the stillness. Thomas and Miller moved carefully, their breath forming clouds in the cold air. The moonlight glowed faintly through the trees, painting everything in shades of gray. They had lost half their men in the crossing. No one spoke about it. There was no time to mourn. After an hour, they reached a small road, little more than a path buried under the snow. On the other side stood a house. Its roof had collapsed in one corner, and the windows were black with soot. But it was shelter. "Let's take a look," Miller said softly. They approached slowly, rifles raised. The front door hung loose on one hinge. Thomas pushed it open. It creaked like something alive. Inside, the air was heavy and still. A broken table lay across the floor, covered in dust and snow. In the corner, a child's toy, a small wooden horse, lay half buried beneath a torn blanket. Thomas froze. He could almost hear laughter again, faint and distant, echoing through the emptiness. He thought of home. He thought of the letters in his pocket. Miller stepped forward, shining a small torch. On the wall, beside the fireplace, hung a photograph. A man, a woman, and 2 children, all smiling. The frame was cracked. The faces were covered with ash. "Civilians," Miller murmured. "Probably fled when the fighting started." Thomas said nothing. He moved closer to the fireplace. There was something there, a pot, still half full of water, frozen solid. It looked as if the family had left in a hurry. Then he noticed a sound. A faint tapping, somewhere behind the wall. He turned sharply. Miller heard it too. "Did you hear that?" They both stood still. The sound came again, slow, irregular, like someone trying to move quietly but failing. Miller gestured to the stairs. "Up there." They climbed carefully, step by step. The floorboards creaked under their weight. At the top of the stairs, a door stood half open. The torchlight trembled as Miller pushed it wider. Inside, the room was small. The air smelled of dust and smoke. And, in the corner, behind a chest of drawers, they saw her. A woman. Her clothes torn, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear. She held a little boy in her arms, no more than 6 years old. Thomas lowered his rifle at once. "It's all right," he said softly. "We're not here to hurt you." The woman didn't speak. She just held the child tighter. Tears welled in her eyes. Miller knelt slowly and took off his helmet. "English," he said quietly, pointing to himself. "Soldier, you're safe now." After a long silence, the woman whispered something in French. Thomas didn't understand the words, but he understood the tone. It was gratitude and exhaustion. Miller sighed. "All right, we'll stay here till dawn, then we move." Thomas nodded. He gave the woman a piece of bread from his pack. She took it with shaking hands, then smiled faintly, a small, fragile smile that somehow felt stronger than all the noise outside. As Thomas sat down by the window, watching the snow fall again, he thought, maybe that's what we're really fighting for. Not victory, just moments like this where something human still survives. The night grew colder. Outside, the wind howled through the broken trees. Inside, the faint warmth of a dying fire flickered against the walls. And, for a brief moment, the war felt far away. The first light of morning crept through the broken window. Snow still fell outside, soft and steady, covering the footprints they had left in the night. The fire in the hearth had burned down to a few glowing embers. Thomas sat by the window, half awake, watching the pale sky turn from gray to white. The woman and the boy were still asleep on the floor, wrapped in old blankets. Their breathing was slow and quiet. For a moment, it almost felt peaceful. Then Miller stirred. He winced as he moved his wounded arm and pulled himself up against the wall. "How long till dawn?" he asked, his voice rough. "It's already here," Thomas said softly. Miller nodded, staring at the floor for a while. Then he said, "Command wanted us to regroup by sunrise. That ridge isn't far, maybe 3 miles." Thomas looked at him, then at the sleeping woman and child. "And what about them?" Miller didn't answer straight away. He rubbed his face with his good hand, thinking, "They'll have to stay. We can't take civilians with us." "They won't survive here," Thomas said quietly. Miller looked up. His eyes were tired, not angry, just empty. "You think any of us will?" Silence settled between them. Outside, the wind began to pick up, whispering through the trees. The sound reminded Thomas of waves against the riverbank back home. He used to find that sound calming. Now, it just felt like a reminder of everything he had lost. He walked over to the woman and crouched beside her. Her eyes opened slowly, frightened at first, then calm when she saw him. He handed her a small canteen of water. She whispered something, a thank you, perhaps, and nodded. Thomas turned back to Miller. "We can at least help them reach the village. It's only a few miles east." Miller frowned. "That's not our mission." Thomas stared at him. "Maybe not, but it's the right thing to do." For a long moment, Miller said nothing. Then he stood up and looked out the window. Far in the distance, faint shapes moved across the snow German patrols, sweeping the woods. He sighed. "All right, we'll get them to the edge of the village, but that's it. After that, we head north to rejoin the others." Thomas nodded, relief mixing with fear. They gathered what little food they had left. The woman helped the boy put on a small coat that was far too thin for the cold. Before leaving, Thomas looked around the house one last time. On a small shelf near the door, he noticed something, a photograph. The same family as before, but this time taken outside in the garden. The boy in the picture was smiling, holding a toy horse, the same one now lying broken on the floor. Thomas placed the photograph carefully back on the shelf and whispered, "I'll bring you home." they stepped outside. The snow was deeper now, the wind colder. Thomas walked beside the woman, while Miller led the way with his rifle ready. The child held Thomas's hand tightly, refusing to let go. As they moved through the trees, the silence of the forest was broken by a distant rumble artillery echoing across the hills. The war was still there, waiting. After an hour, they reached a ridge overlooking the valley. Below, the remains of a small village lay half buried in snow and smoke. Thomas stopped. There was nothing left, only ruins. The woman gasped quietly. Tears filled her eyes. She knew. Miller lowered his rifle. "Looks like the Germans got here first," he said. Thomas turned to him. "So, what now?" Miller hesitated. "We keep moving north." Thomas looked back at the woman and child. They were shivering, standing in the snow, lost and afraid. He knew the order. He also knew what it meant. And in that frozen silence he felt the weight of every letter he had ever written. Every promise, every word of hope he had sent to someone waiting far away. He took a deep breath. "I'm staying," he said. Miller's eyes widened. "You'll be shot if they find you here. Then so be it." For a long moment neither man spoke. Then Miller nodded slowly. "Good luck, lad." Thomas watched as his sergeant disappeared into the trees. Then he turned to the woman and the child. They looked at him with silent gratitude and fear. He didn't know if he could save them, but he knew he had to try. The wind howled through the valley, carrying with it the distant sound of gunfire. And as the first shell fell in the distance, Thomas whispered to himself, "If anyone ever finds this story, tell her I tried." Thomas led them through a narrow ravine, the snow now knee-deep. The trees were sparse here, stripped bare by winter winds. Every crunch of their boots seemed deafening in the frozen silence. The woman clutched her coat tighter, and the boy's small hand was ice-cold in Thomas's. He kept glancing behind them, expecting shadows, expecting rifles. Every branch that cracked made his heart leap. "Quiet," he whispered. The woman nodded, eyes wide, searching his face for reassurance. They found a ruined farmhouse, half collapsed, hidden by a low hill. Thomas checked the windows, the doors, the walls, any place the enemy might overlook. It was far from safe, but it would do for the night. Inside, they huddled around what remained of the hearth. Thomas rummaged through the debris and found a box of matches and a few charred logs. He lit a small fire. The warmth was shallow, but it was enough to thaw their fingers. The woman looked at him silently, her eyes brimming with tears. She had said nothing since they arrived, but Thomas could feel her fear. And beneath that fear, hope. "I need to write it," Thomas muttered. "Write what?" she asked. He pulled a piece of paper from his pocket, soaked with sweat and snow. "It's a letter. To his father." He pointed to the boy. "I can't promise he'll see it, but if he does, I want him to know he was brave, that he mattered." The woman handed him a pencil. The boy leaned over the table, curious but silent. Thomas wrote carefully, every word deliberate, every sentence a promise. "Father, if you read this, know I am safe. Your son is brave beyond measure. I do not fear the darkness, because I'm not alone. A man helped me when the world abandoned us. Remember him as I will always remember you." When he finished, He folded the letter and placed it inside the boy's coat. "I'll make sure it reaches someone who cares," he said softly. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the distant thud of artillery. Thomas knew the enemy would return in the morning. They would scour the forest, searching for survivors, searching for escapees. He looked at the woman. "You have to be ready to move," he said. She nodded, silent understanding passing between them. He settled near the door, keeping watch. Every shadow could be a rifle barrel. Every gust of wind could mask an approaching soldier. Yet, in that frozen fear, Thomas felt an odd serenity. He had done what he could. He had chosen humanity over orders, compassion over survival. Hours passed. Snow fell harder, blanketing the ruins. At dawn, Thomas nudged the boy awake. "We move," he whispered. They emerged into the pale light, the world coated in white. Tracks from the night snow covered most of their trail, but they pressed on, moving with care. By midday, they reached a river crossing. The ice was thin, and Thomas tested each step before moving forward. The woman whispered a prayer. The boy shivered, but followed bravely. On the other side, a small village appeared abandoned, silent, half-burnt. Thomas scanned the rooftops, the streets, the alleys. No soldiers in sight. They ran, silently, through the streets until they reached a cellar door. Inside was dark but safe. He lit a small lantern and they huddled in the shadows. The woman pressed the boy to her chest. "Thank you," she whispered. Thomas shook his head. No thanks needed. Just survive. He watched them for a long moment. Then he pulled the letter from the boy's coat. He placed it carefully in his pocket. Outside, the world was quiet again, but Thomas knew the danger had not passed. Yet, in that small cellar, with the warmth of human life beside him, he felt the first true hope he had in weeks. The last letter was not sent, not yet. But it existed. A testament of courage, of survival, and of the choices that define us when the world falls apart. And somewhere, far away, someone would read it. Someone would know. Someone would remember. The war had not ended for them, but it had begun to end within him. Years passed. The forest had long since healed its scars, snow replaced by green, the ruins covered in ivy and moss. The world moved on, oblivious to the small acts of courage that had taken place in those hidden corners of the earth. Thomas never returned to that village. He moved silently through the war-torn landscape, a ghost among survivors and soldiers alike. But the boy grew. He carried the last letter with him always, folded neatly in his coat, worn at the edges but intact. It was a lifeline, a reminder of a man who had chosen compassion over orders, humanity over duty. The woman watched over him, guiding him with a quiet strength that Thomas had recognized in her eyes that first night. Together, they survived the final months of the war, moving from village to village, avoiding patrols, scavenging for food, and always keeping one step ahead of death. Eventually, the boy reached the age where he could leave the shadows behind. He took the letter carefully and mailed it to an address Thomas had given him, a distant relative, someone who would know the boy's father. It was a small act, but it bridged the gap between despair and hope. And in that simple act, the story of Thomas, the boy, and the woman began to ripple outward. The letter reached hands that wept, that remembered, that honored. The war's horrors remained, but this small seed of humanity endured. Thomas never sought recognition. He never spoke of his deeds. He walked through the world quietly, carrying the memory of a night when fear had been defeated not by weapons, but by courage, compassion, and the unwavering belief that even in darkness, humans could choose to protect one another. Decades later, the boy, now a man, sat by a window in a small home far from the ruins of Europe. He held the letter in his hands, the handwriting smudged with age, and he thought of Thomas. He thought of the woman. He thought of the cold winter night that had tested them all. He read the words aloud softly. "Father, if you read this, know I am safe. Your son is brave beyond measure. I do not fear the darkness, because I'm not alone." The man smiled, tears in his eyes. The war had ended long ago, but the courage, the choices, the humanity that had guided them through the darkness, that endured. And somewhere Thomas walked quietly, a shadow among many, unaware of the lives he had saved, the hope he had inspired. His legacy was not medals or honors. It was life. It was survival. It was the knowledge that one person, one choice, could alter the course of history for those who followed. The final moment of quiet, the snow had returned to Europe, soft and endless. Somewhere beneath it, the ruins of that farmhouse lay forgotten. Yet the echoes of courage, compassion, and hope persisted, carried in a folded letter, in the hearts of the survivors, and in the memory of a man who chose humanity when the world demanded cruelty. The war had ended, yet the sky still bore scars of the battles fought above it. Carrier decks, once filled with roaring engines and smoke, were now silent. Airfields, stripped bare of aircraft, echoed with memories of dogfights that had shaped the Pacific. Thomas walked along the empty runway, the wind carrying whispers of the past. He remembered the faces of the pilots he had watched, the smoke trails that had vanished into the horizon, the fear that had pressed against his chest like a physical weight. He paused at a shattered hangar, where sunlight filtered through holes in the roof, illuminating fragments of metal twisted by bullets and fire. Each piece told a story: the bravery of a young pilot, the desperation of a crew defending their homeland, the quiet heroism of those who risked everything to protect others. Even as nations celebrated victory, Thomas understood the true cost. For every aircraft in the sky, for every medal awarded, there were lives irrevocably altered. The mathematics of war, kill ratios, sorties, and production numbers did not capture the fear, the courage, or the choices that defined human survival. He thought of the boy, now a man, carrying a legacy of hope. Of the woman who had guided him through the darkness, teaching resilience without words, without fanfare. Of Thomas himself, a man who had chosen action over indifference, courage over surrender. In the quiet, he wrote in his journal, a habit formed from years of witnessing history unfold. The world remembers the battles, the machines, the strategies. Few remember the small acts of humanity. Yet these are the true victories. Across the ocean, former pilots gathered, their voices older but firm, recounting the lessons learned. The F-6F. Hellcat had not merely won air battles, it had rewritten the principles of warfare. But the memories of those on the other side, those who had faced it and survived by chance or choice, lingered in letters, diaries, and whispered stories. Thomas reflected on the paradox. Technology had shaped the outcome, yet human decisions had preserved life, hope, and memory. In the quiet nights that followed, he would sit, staring at the stars, imagining the formations of aircraft in the skies of 1944, and the courage it took to survive a world engulfed in fire. The Pacific War was over, but its echoes would last for generations. And in the heart of one man, the weight of memory was both a burden and a gift, a reminder that even amidst destruction, humanity could endure. Not all heroes flew. Some labored behind the scenes, their hands blackened by oil, sweat, and determination. In a small hangar on a remote Pacific island, Corporal Kenji Watanabe adjusted the landing gear on a Zero. He had never flown, but every rivet he tightened, every bolt he checked, determined whether a pilot would return home or fall into the sea. Watanabe worked quietly, unseen, yet he carried the weight of lives in his hands. Across the ocean, in the United States, mechanic Robert Langford polished the undercarriage of an F-6F Hellcat, following instructions meticulously. Each adjustment mattered. The lives of pilots, like Thomas, like Eugene Valencia, depended on his precision. In the vast machinery of war, small acts like these were invisible threads that held the fabric of survival together. Meanwhile, civilians watched from the shadows. In Manila, a young nurse bandaged the wounds of both friend and foe, recognizing the shared humanity beneath uniforms of different colors. Her hands shook, but she worked tirelessly, a quiet witness to the human cost of aerial supremacy. Stories emerged from the carriers themselves. Lieutenant Roy Rushing recalled the first time he led a squadron against overwhelming numbers. His voice trembled in the retelling, even decades later. We were outnumbered, yes, but we had training, discipline, and each other. And somehow we survived. The pilots of the Hellcats were often young men, barely older than boys, yet they displayed a discipline and coordination that became legend. Their formation flying was precise, almost mechanical, yet beneath it pulsed human courage and instinct. Every engagement was a dance between life and death, a testament to skill, strategy, and the relentless pressure of war. Across the Pacific, letters and diaries captured the fragments of memory that machines and statistics could never convey. A young Japanese pilot wrote, "We were taught to honor the sky and our aircraft, yet we were unprepared for what came. The Hellcats, they did not fight as we expected. They were relentless, and we were not ready." Each page, each testimony added depth to the narrative of the Hellcat. Not merely a machine of war, it became a symbol, a mirror reflecting courage, innovation, and the limitations of human expectation. Thomas, having survived the conflict, understood this deeply. He knew that behind every pilot, every mechanic, every nurse, and every letter, there existed a story of courage and choice. And, though the war was over, these stories demanded to be remembered, not as statistics, but as fragments of humanity persisting amidst destruction. The sun rose over the Pacific once more, painting the ocean with gold and crimson. Waves lapped gently against the hulls of carriers now anchored in quiet harbors. In that stillness, one could almost hear the ghosts of engines, the whispers of pilots, the silent dedication of those who labored unseen. The war had shaped a generation, defined a technology, and altered the course of nations. Yet its truest legacy lived in the hearts, hands, and choices of individuals, the faces of war who survived, endured, and bore witness to history. By early 1945, the Pacific skies had grown darker. The Japanese Navy, once a force of awe-inspiring precision, now faced the relentless pressure of overwhelming numbers, technology, and strategy. Lieutenant Hiroshi Seki climbed into a Zero, the metal cold beneath his hands, the engine growling to life. Training hours had dwindled, his experience measured in mere days rather than years. Yet duty demanded he fly to defend his homeland, to face enemies whose aircraft had become legends. Across the ocean, Lieutenant Eugen Valencia adjusted his helmet, reviewing the sortie plan with his division. The F-6F. Hellcats would escort bombers, intercept enemy formations, and enforce control of the skies. Every mission followed the doctrines they had perfected: altitude advantage, coordinated attacks, disciplined energy fighting. Every maneuver carried the weight of experience, industry, and survival. The first wave departed at dawn. Japanese Zeros, fueled by desperation and a sense of duty, rose in fragmented formations. They lacked the coordination, the firepower, and often the skill to challenge the Hellcats effectively. Yet they flew with courage, knowing the odds, accepting the probability of death. From the deck of an American carrier, observers watched the battle unfold. The sky was a theater of motion. Loops, dives, and climbing spirals, aircraft moving as extensions of the pilot's intent. The Hellcats struck with deadly precision, slicing through formations of fighters and bombers alike, and yet sparing those who faltered but survived, a grim testament to disciplined control. The kamikaze pilots had begun their missions. Young men, some barely old enough to vote, transformed into living missiles, their aircraft armed with explosives and intent. They were guided by a doctrine of sacrifice, believing that death held honor, that destruction carried meaning. Lieutenant Thomas observed one such attack from a distance. A plane dove with terrifying speed, yet coordination among the Hellcats ensured that many were intercepted, the threat neutralized before reaching their targets. Each successful interception was not merely a victory of mettle and strategy, but a reflection of industrial precision and human ingenuity. The Pacific, vast and indifferent, bore witness to each sortie. Islands once teeming with airfields now lay in ruin, their runways scarred and their hangars empty. The sky, once dominated by a handful of elite pilots, was now a battlefield of numbers, training, and technology. By June, the war's final months were defined by attrition. Experienced Japanese pilots had been lost. Inexperienced replacements struggled to survive. The Hellcats flew relentlessly, guided by radar, doctrine, and the disciplined coordination of men who had trained tirelessly. Yet, amidst the carnage, individual stories emerged. Lieutenant Seki, despite his inexperience, survived multiple engagements. Mechanics who had labored day and night watched their aircraft return, battered but alive. Civilians who had endured bombings and occupation recorded fragments of memory, small acts of courage, moments of mercy, and the quiet endurance of those caught between nations at war. By August 1945, the last missions had flown. The sky was quiet, but the echoes of combat lingered in every memory, every scar, every piece of twisted metal recovered from the battlefields. The war in the Pacific had been decided not only by technology, training, or numbers, but by the human will to endure, adapt, and survive. As the Emperor's surrender was announced, the remaining pilots of both sides lowered their heads, not in defeat or victory alone, but in recognition of a shared human cost. The F-6F Hellcat had claimed supremacy in the skies, but it had also revealed the limits of courage without support, skill without training, and tradition without adaptation. The war had ended, but its echoes persisted. The skies over the Pacific were calm, yet every cloud, every glint of sun on water seemed to carry the memory of flight, fire, and loss. Veterans returned home, carrying medals, scars, and memories too vivid to forget. Lieutenant Eugene Valencia wrote in his journal, "We flew machines of war, yet it was humanity that determined the outcome. Courage, discipline, and the choices we made, these were our true weapons." In Japan, surviving pilots like Saburo Sakai reflected on the rapid collapse of naval air power. The Zero had been a marvel of design, a testament to skill and ingenuity. But technology had advanced, strategies had changed, and the industrial might of America had created an instrument that could not be outmatched in conventional combat. The Hellcat did not merely destroy aircraft, it reshaped doctrines, philosophies, and expectations. It revealed the limits of individual skill when faced with a systemic innovation. It demonstrated that in modern warfare, machines, coordination, and production were as decisive as courage and training. Mechanics, medics, and support crews understood this truth as well. Every plane repaired, every bullet counted, every coordinated mission flown, it all mattered. Victory was never about a single hero. It was about networks of humans working in synchrony, powered by knowledge, discipline, and persistence. Civilian witnesses recorded the war's impact in diaries, photographs, and memoirs. A nurse in Okinawa wrote, "We saw the bravery of both sides and the fragility of life. The war claimed more than soldiers. It took families, childhoods, and certainty. But it also revealed resilience we did not know we possessed." The F-F Hellcat became more than a machine. It became a symbol of transformation. It was a demonstration that adaptation, learning, and industrial innovation could overturn even the most revered traditions. The samurai spirit of the Zero pilots met a machine that embodied a different philosophy: efficiency, coordination, and preservation of life. In museums, aircraft stand silent, their metal polished, engines stilled. Yet stories echo through the halls of aces and novices, victories and defeats, courage and loss. Each photograph, each artifact carries a fragment of human experience, a lesson in strategy, resilience, and humility. The ultimate legacy of the Pacific Air War is not merely the number of aircraft destroyed or the ratio of victories. It is the understanding that war tests humanity at every level, from the individual pilot to the machinery they operate to the societies that support them. It is a testament to innovation, discipline, and the profound costs of conflict. As the sun sets over quiet harbors, one can almost hear the distant hum of engines, the whispers of pilots, the silent devotion of those who labored unseen. The F-6F Hellcat soared through history, leaving behind a lesson as enduring as any memorial: that victory belongs not only to those who fight, but to those who prepare, innovate, and adapt.